While polygon graphs are great to observe the frequencies of each class at its midpoint, an ogive graph is more interested in the cumulative frequencies. Ogive graphs are line graphs of the upper limits which are represented on the x-axis, and either the cumulative frequency or the cumulative relative frequencies with an extra point on the left at y equals 0 for the first lower limit. So we always use the upper limits on the x-axis, except for the very first one on the left is going to have a height of 0, representing where the graph starts. And if you remember, we have been working with this hours spent on homework. And if I go back and look at my chart from that, we had low values and high values for the ranges in that frequency distribution. And each one had a associated cumulative relative frequency that we calculated. So the low value was 1.5. The high value was 5.5. The cumulative relative frequency was 0.1818. The next class went from 5.5 to 9.5 with a cumulative relative frequency of 0.5909. The third class went from 9.5 to 13.5 with a cumulative relative frequency of 0.9545. And the fourth class went from 13.5 to 17.5. And the cumulative relative frequency there was 1.000. So if we want to graph this as an ogive, we're going to use the limits as our x values. So the 5.5 through the 17.5. But remember, we have one extra one at the low value of 1.5. So we've got 1.5, 5.5, 9.5, 13.5, and 17.5. And we're using the cumulative relative frequencies. So I'm going to go up by 0.10s, maybe 0.10, 0.20, 0.30, 0.40, 0.50, 0.60, 0.70, 0.80, 0.90, and 1.0. And then on this graph, we can graph the points. At 1.5, we start with a height of 0. That's what we said on the left, that height of 0, y equals 0. And then we graph the high values with their cumulative relative frequency. So at 5.5, the cumulative relative frequency was 0.1818, which is about here on the graph. At 9.5, the cumulative relative frequency was 5909, which is about here on the graph. At 13.5, it was 9545, which is about here on the graph. And then at 17.5, it's at 1.0, which is about here on the graph. And so when we connect these lines, we see our sharp increases in the middle and the graduals on the edges. That ends up being our ogive graph, graphing the cumulative relative frequencies in relationship to the higher end of each bin or each class, with one extra point on the left representing the first lower limit at 0. Now, of course, every good graph needs a title. This is not going to have a title of ogive because that's the type of graph. What we're looking at is the time spent on homework. The x-axis is the time upper limits in hours. And then the y-axis is the cumulative relative frequency. And that becomes my ogive graph representing the cumulative relative frequencies as we go through our data set.